Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week we're delving into foreign lobbying with investigative journalist Casey Michel, now author of the new book, Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Welcome, Casey.
Thanks so much for having me, Bradley.
So, Casey, tell me a bit more about how you ended up writing this book. What's been your career trajectory that you ended up focusing in on this fascinating topic?
Sure. Yeah. It's a great question, and certainly one I find myself asking myself plenty of times. I've kind of bounced around a little bit over the last 10 years. My first real entree and intro to the world of transnational money laundering, kleptocracy, authoritarianism, and dictatorship writ large. I was a Peace Corps volunteer back in northern Kazakhstan many years ago. That was my first time living and working and operating in a country overseen by an authoritarian, at that time clearly dictatorial regime that nonetheless was moving its money into Western jurisdictions, using financial secrecy vehicles, using offshoring finance tools, and also, for the purposes of this book, using foreign lobbying networks, using PR firms, using consultancies, using law firms, and using all of these, in this case, Americans as their representatives in Washington, D.C. and around the United States of America, not only laundering their image, whitewashing the image of the dictator who was then ruling the country, but also pushing preferred policies. At the end of the day, what would be in the Kazakhstani regime's best interest, and who are those Americans on the ground that can help make it so. So anyways, that's where I really began getting interested in this space. I came back to the United States, began working as a journalist in places like Texas and Minnesota, eventually in New York. I went to graduate school for Russian and post-Soviet studies, which just so happened, again, to intersect with my interest in foreign lobbying, because I ended up interacting with some of these foreign lobbyists who were representing places like Kazakhstan, places like Azerbaijan, these other kleptocratic regimes that, again, are pursuing similar ends, using similar networks in places like Washington and elsewhere. And I don't think I need to recap kind of general American history since 2016, but certainly the topics of, the threats of, the concerns around, the prosecutions around foreign lobbying and foreign lobbyists writ large have been front and center year after year. I mean, it really has been, for someone like myself who got interested in this space before 2016. I mean, it's been very head spinning. I feel like I've had whiplash so many times in how relevant some of these topics and some of these figures ended up becoming. And Bradley, I'm sure it's the same for you as someone who's worked so deeply and has been so steeped in this space, to see how relevant, transnational money laundering networks and the kind of downstream effects of those, how relevant that has all become, has also been, head spinning, head scratching. I don't know. I could never have predicted it.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of those spaces where people have some sort of concept in their mind that this is going on, but maybe it is not impactful. Like, how would the president of the United States be, or anybody in the government be impacted by these kind of obvious lobbying things? But maybe you could just kind of explain just how effective it is, and also maybe a little bit about the history of this. I feel like it's kind of recent that people really started enforcing the FARA rules and things like that. So I would love to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, you're 100% right. So there's I think it's worth kind of giving a brief overview of the history of the industry, what we're actually talking about at the end of the day. And what we are talking about are Americans, American firms, American organizations, American officials, former American officials that have since left Congress, those that have American citizenship, and because of that have the constitutional right to lobby their representatives in Washington and elsewhere. I mean, I think a lot of folks may not recall that the right to lobby is a protected right in the American Constitution, in the very First Amendment. The right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, or frankly, a redress of anything, is right there, front and center, alongside the rights of, the freedoms of religion, the freedoms of press, so on and so forth, so many of these other cherished rights that we as Americans hold. And lobbying in and of itself in the United States goes back to the very founding of the American Republic back in the 1770s, 1780s. And the book goes into a little bit of that history itself. But what by the early 20th century, as we kind of saw the first inklings of a globalized world, globalized economy, what we saw at the beginning of the 20th century is more Americans realizing that, yes, there are plenty of domestic constituents, domestic organizations, domestic political parties and forces they can lobby on behalf of, but there were a few Americans who realized, well, they can also do that perfectly legally on behalf of non-American organizations, on behalf of foreign organizations, or in some cases even foreign governments. And again, the book goes into further history, but one of the primary characters that I focus on in the book itself is a gentleman named Ivy Lee, who is considered by many to be the father of the public relations industry. But what happened in a lesser-known chapter of his career is he also ended up lobbying, as we now understand it, directly on behalf of figures like Benito Mussolini in Rome, Soviet higher-ups in Moscow, and most notoriously, higher-ups in the Nazi Party in Berlin through the 1920s and into the 1930s. Ivy Lee ended up dying before the Second World War, but he opened up all of these doors in Washington to the most heinous regimes on the planet. And what I found in researching the book is what he ended up doing was setting the blueprint for what Americans by the late 20th and early 21st century really returned to doing. That is to say, by the late 20th and the early 21st century, after the end of the Cold War, that's when we saw this real resurgence of the foreign lobbying industry in and of itself, in its kind of modern incarnation. And it is these individuals, these PR firms, these law firms, consulting firms, increasingly in recent decades, places like think tanks, even places like universities, as well as plenty of dozens and dozens of former congressional officials who sign up freely and legally to act as mouthpieces for any regime, any government around the world, but most especially for my purposes and certainly my interest, the most heinous, the most kleptocratic dictatorial regimes on the planet, these kind of rising fascistic regimes that really in many ways resemble what we saw in the 1920s and 1930s in the lead up to the Second World War. Now, Bradley, in your question, you mentioned something called FARA. And that is an acronym, just as most things in the federal government are. FARA, it stands for the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And that is a single piece of legislation that dates all the way back to the days of Ivy Lee, the gentleman I just mentioned a moment ago who was lobbying on behalf of the Nazis. He was eventually found out for what he was doing, and legislators in the 1930s realized there needs to be some kind of transparency for what these lobbying networks are doing. And so they implemented the Foreign Agents Registration Act all the way back in 1938. And it's a very simple piece of legislation. It just says these lobbyists need to disclose what they're doing, who they're doing it on behalf of, and how much they're being paid. They don't have to stop doing any of this. They just have to share with the federal government, and then beyond that, the American populace, who they're actually representing, what they're being paid, and what they're actually doing with that money. Now, that's all great, of course, in theory, but as you mentioned a moment ago, in practice, that fell into complete disuse for decades. And it wasn't until the late 2010s and early 2020s when American officials realized, well, I don't know if we can swear on this podcast, but well, crap, I guess we should have been enforcing this because the industry is now a multi-billion-dollar industry that no one was paying any attention to until the late 2010s, early 2020s, when we finally saw legislators and policymakers realizing they need to actually begin enforcing some of these transparency requirements. Otherwise, these networks are just going to run that much more amok than they've been running already.
Was there some reason why that changed? I mean, other than the realization, were there some cases, was there some activity that really set alarm bells ringing?
As I'm sure you and most of the listeners recall, in the mid-2010s, there was a new political force, a new political figure that surged to the fore in American politics, a gentleman named Donald Trump, who brought his own world of questionable financial entanglements via his real estate investments as well as other investments to a range of regimes, again, around the world, including places like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, but also places like Malaysia, certainly places like Russia, places in North Africa, places in the Caribbean, so on and so forth. I mean, again, really unlike anything seen in American history. But it wasn't necessarily the rise of Trump and the concerns about his own foreign financial entanglements. It was really those that he had in his inner circle. Paul Manafort, who, if he's known to listeners at all, is known as or is remembered as Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager, really is one of the primary reasons Donald Trump ended up being launched to the presidency in the first place, but was working for years and years before that as kind of this like arch foreign lobbyist himself, really the kind of prototype for what a modern foreign lobbyist looks like. He was working with regimes in Nigeria, in the Philippines, in Somalia, most, again, notoriously in places like Ukraine, where he was laundering the image of the kind of budding autocrat, the pro-Kremlin thug that was in power until the 2014 revolution, and all too often not registering any of this work, not disclosing any of this work, and with the federal government like he was supposed to be doing. And the real concern was that in 2016, 2017, he'd also opened the doors to a range of pro-Russian and pro-Kremlin oligarchs and oligarch-linked figures. Now, there's still plenty we don't know about that. There's still plenty that's been redacted in some of the governmental investigations into what Manafort was actually doing. But this is a long-winded way of answering your question, Bradley, is that it was not just Donald Trump's rise, but also the figures that he brought with him, like Manafort, like some of his other advisors who had close links with regimes in places like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, which forced folks in Washington to realize, oh, these foreign lobbying networks are far more developed, far more wide-reaching than anyone ever realized. And again, thanks to the rise of a figure like Trump, now have far more access directly in the White House than anyone ever anticipated.
And do we know anything about what Paul Manafort is up to or where he is now?
The most recent reporting, and unfortunately this is literally within the last month or so it wasn't able to make it into the book itself, is that he had actually been in conversations with the Trump 2024 campaign to travel to the Republican National Convention, which is ongoing as we speak in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to act as an organizer, kind of a delegate organizer on the ground. He had this long and in many ways storied history as kind of, maybe not a kingmaker necessarily in the Republican Party, but certainly one of the primary organizers of things like the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s, in things like Bob Dole's campaigns in the mid-1990s, perhaps best known as the campaign organizer, convention organizer for Bob Dole in 1996. Again, he has this really, really, truly deep legacy and history in the Republican Party. So seeing him tapped as a potential organizer for 2024 wasn't necessarily surprising, again, given that he was also involved in Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. But I should also say, it came out in the Washington Post, he had not stopped his foreign lobbying work. He was in conversations with at least one Chinese entity about opening doors for them in Washington to apparently expand investments or potentially even influence Chinese-related policy in D.C., in Congress, and then beyond that in the White House itself. As far as I'm aware, none of that was registered in the Foreign Agents Registration Act. It's certainly possible more folks are looking into him and whether or not that work should have been registered. He was, for context's sake, and this is, again, the last thing I'll say about him right now, he was convicted in the late 2010s, early 2020s on a range of charges, most especially including failing to register his work as a foreign lobbyist. And then right before Donald Trump left office in 2021, he was pardoned. So that record has now been expunged, and he is, according to the most recent reporting, back to his familiar space and back to his old work.
Just for the audiences to understand better, some of this stuff is so abstract of what these guys get up to. But what does the life of a foreign lobbyist look like? What does success look like for them? Are there any examples of outrageous things that were done by foreign lobbyists?
We're speaking here on, I think today is July 17th, here in the middle of July in 2024. We're speaking literally 24 hours after a conviction unlike anything we've ever seen in American history, a conviction of a sitting senator, Bob Menendez, in the great state of New Jersey, for acting as a foreign agent, effectively a foreign lobbyist, on behalf of the government in Egypt. And the reason that I mention him is he's not necessarily a prototypical example of a foreign lobbyist. Again, members of Congress are not legally allowed to act as a foreign lobbyist themselves, which is why we've never seen any conviction like this in American history. But in terms of some of the more ridiculous elements of that, right, that involves Bob Menendez receiving from intermediaries gold bars that he then proceeded to Google how much is a gold bar worth, how much is a kilo of gold worth, so on and so forth. Again, these kind of ridiculous elements. We have luxury handbags, we have Michelin star restaurants, but a lot more of these foreign lobbyists are maybe run-of-the-mill lobbyists themselves, right? This is the world that they already come from, not necessarily always deep-pocketed or even necessarily tapping into the kind of offshore financial secrecy vehicles that folks like Manafort were certainly familiar with. I mean, these are folks that are organizing meetings in D.C. These are folks that are writing op-eds. These are folks that are going on television. These are folks that are organizing constituents meetings, again, on behalf of foreign regimes, foreign organizations, foreign oligarchs, to launder those images of those regimes, to convince their audiences that these aren't actually dictators. These are, transitioning democracies. These aren't oligarchs. These are budding tycoons, similar to what we saw in the United States 100 or 120 years ago. These are not figures and forces we need to be concerned with. Instead, these are regimes and governments we should partner with. We should ally with. We should keep in our good graces. And all those other dissidents, all those other journalists that are criticizing him, or in places like Saudi Arabia's case, journalists who are assassinated for criticizing that regime, we should not listen to them. We should put them to the side. We should ignore them so that we can keep these regimes in America's good graces, open up the spigots of foreign aid, of military aid, of organizing presidential or cabinet level visits, so on and so forth. I mean, it really is a relatively large playbook.
In your reporting, have you spent much time with these lobbyists and hearing how they view themselves? I mean, what would a foreign lobbyist say right now in response to what you're saying? I mean, what would they be? How would they be arguing against you?
There is a quote that comes to mind. I should say, so my book, as far as I'm aware, is the very first one that's taken a look at the history of the industry in totality, again, tracing it back a century plus, to say nothing of the developments in the past few years. But I do want to plug another book that came out maybe 10 or 11 years ago, which is really ahead of the curve in this space. It's by another investigative journalist named Ken Silverstein. The book is called Turkmenis Scam. Bradley, I don't know if you've had the chance to read it. It's pretty short, but it's certainly fantastic, and really had the its eye on the ball even before a lot of other folks began paying attention to this more recently. The book itself, he poses as a foreign lobbyist for the like Stalinist regime in Turkmenistan, and goes to other American firms to try to sign up more lobbyists on behalf of this firm. I won't spoil the book itself. To suffice it to say, he finds plenty of success. But there was one quote which I think summarizes certainly my interactions with foreign lobbyists, but what he also found in his time as a reporter. I'll have to paraphrase. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but the quote is, the ethos is, well, in the court of law, certainly in the American court of law, every defendant has the right to counsel, has the right to a lawyer to represent themselves. Who are we to say that every regime, every oligarch, every transnational criminal network, any individual accused of transnational kleptocratic crimes, who's to say they aren't also entitled to their own defense in the public space? And who's to say I shouldn't, or my firm shouldn't, or my colleagues shouldn't be the one? We're not committing any crimes. There is nothing illegal in what we are doing. And by the way, if we don't do it, then some of our competitors would be the ones to do it. So why shouldn't we be the ones doing it? Because at the end of the day, aren't they entitled to their own say in the court of public opinion, if not necessarily the court of law itself? That has been the ethos that has been driving these foreign lobbyists for certainly most recently decades. But if you go all the way back to figures like Ivy Lee, you can go back a century and look at the the fascists under Mussolini in Rome, look at the rising communists in Moscow, and certainly look at the Nazi regime in Berlin. They were all peddling the same arguments, and at the time found the same success as what we have seen in recent years in the United States.
So your book's coming out just ahead of the U.S. elections, presidential elections. I mean, what has been the role of foreign lobbying in 2024? I mean, is there some good examples aside from Menendez of why this is such a big part of what we're coming up against?
That's a great question, Bradley. And I, again, what I try to do in conversations like this for listeners, I would highly recommend, if nothing else, if you have no other takeaway from this, even beyond hopefully pre-ordering my book, which is out at the end of August, and it's called Foreign Agents, go online, go to the Department of Justice website, go look up the Foreign Agents Registration Act database. You can even just Google FARA database, or Foreign Agents Registration Act database, and you will find it. It is a publicly accessible database. You can be in the United States, you can be in any country that is, at least you're allowed to access the U.S. Department of Justice website, and you can look through what any country is doing. You can look through what any firm is doing, how much money they are being made, what is actually being done on the ground, who is involved, how long they've been involved, when contracts ended, when contracts began, so on and so forth. It is an absolute goldmine of information. Certainly, my book would not have been written without it. Bradley, I'm sure you have encountered this in plenty of your work in the past. It has been an overlooked resource for years and years, and I, again, highly recommend for anyone interested in any regime, any network, any lobbying firm, go online and look it up. In 2024, that database is certainly available. We just mentioned the Menendez conviction, which came out just 24 hours ago from this recording. Again, the first time in American history we have ever seen a conviction like this. It is truly unprecedented, uncharted waters we are in, but the Menendez case was not the only one in which a sitting member of Congress has recently been formally indicted on foreign lobbying charges. There was a representative out of the great state of Texas, a gentleman named Henry Cuellar from South Texas, also a Democrat like Bob Menendez, who was formally charged just 2 months ago with acting as a foreign agent, in his case on behalf of the dictatorship in Azerbaijan. There's a very clear likelihood that he may end up seeing a conviction as well. And all this is in addition to the continuing networks themselves on the lobbying side. Again, those think tanks that continue to receive foreign funding, but don't have to disclose it because they're not technically lobbyists. The universities that have, again, for years been supposed to be disclosing foreign donations and foreign gifts, but recently have not. That has fallen off completely as well.
It's amazing. I think also it's one of those things where if you have a cursory understanding of money laundering or things like that, you always think of it as being outside of the U.S. It's all happening on offshore islands and other places. And the same thing goes for almost like the sanctity of the White House. I mean, maybe I was at once quite naive, but I was always shocked to find out the kinds of people that somehow find themselves in the White House with a picture with the President of the United States. Now, namely, one of them is Joe Low, and Joe Low is a good example because he was pouring money into U.S. politics via Casey Michel, the rapper, who was, giving it to friends who were then donating it. And he was also working really closely with this guy called Frank White, who was a bundler for Obama. But he just spent his way into the White House and got the picture, and he used it all the time. And there's a lot of people in the world that have a picture from them with themselves in the White House, and they use it to do bad things. It's kind of amazing. I talked to a guy who once told me, he was telling me how naive I was and how idealistic I was about the United States. And he was saying it's the most corrupt country he'd ever dealt with, was his kind of argument. And no, that's obviously an exaggeration, but he was saying it's so easy to spend money in America and get a result. It's just it's the American way, and that was his point of view. And then ever since then, now I don't say I subscribe to his point of view, but it does kind of start to, rise up again when I see some of these cases,
Look, Bradley, I think that there's nothing wrong with being idealistic. Certainly, I once was on my own end at some point, and then you work more and more in this space, and I think that idealism kind of maybe ebbs and flows a little bit. But, and of course, you also went into obviously extraordinary detail on the 1MDB scandal, Joe Low and his entire lobbying network in Billion Dollar Whale. And I should say, I don't get into the Casey Michel foreign agents, foreign lobbying side of things. I mentioned Elliot Broidy, who, as memory serves, was also involved in this, although he was, of course, connected to other lobbying networks as well, and ended up indicted and then convicted on those charges.
And then pardoned.
And then, of course,
as you do.
We don't have to go into that detour, but yes, there has been significant setbacks because of certain pardons from former President Trump in this space. But you mentioned the kind of idealism, cynicism, so on and so forth. I think that it's been in putting this book together, and my first book was on the American financial secrecy services industry, the shell companies, the trusts, the real estate purchases, the art auction house purchases, so on and so forth, that allow for the anonymization and offshoreization of so much money around the world. I think between that book and this book, what I've realized, or maybe I've certainly had plenty of people tell me this already, is that so many of these tools, so many of these policies, so many of these networks, whether on the offshoring side, whether on the lobbying side, these were all initially domestic considerations aimed at domestic clients for domestic purposes with domestic ends. So whether that is, again, the kind of lobbying networks we saw emerge in the late 19th century, early 20th century, again, where figures like Ivy Lee came out of working on behalf of, figures like the Rockefellers or Charles Schwab or eventually Woodrow Wilson, and having them gain access to the White House and, of course, pursue policies that they preferred. But even then, in the 1970s and the 1980s, when we saw the kind of modern lobbying industry really come into its own, so much of it was geared directly toward domestic clients, domestic constituents, again, bringing the kind of lobbying and political consulting worlds together so that the major conglomerates and major domestic industries can gain access to, can gain influence within the White Houses, the American administrations of the kind of mid to late 20th century. And then all throughout, these lobbyists realizing, okay, we've done this domestically. My God, look at how many other clients there are internationally. And look how few restrictions, how few strictures there are in terms of actually accessing all of that money that is swilling around outside of America's borders, connected to these regimes, looking to find a home, and in this case, looking to find ways to influence American foreign policy or even American domestic policy. And of course, yes, gaining those coveted White House photo ops that can, last in perpetuity as well.
Absolutely. Well, one more question for you before I let you go, which is, I know you have to get home quickly before the AC cuts off. You are also the director of the Combating Kleptocracy program at the Human Rights Foundation. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, are you out there in the shadows, fighting off these forces? Come on, give us something exciting that you're up to.
I'm not. The lights are off right now, so technically, I suppose I am in the shadows. I mean, look, it's an opportunity, it's a platform for me to continue doing what I have been doing for years and years. That is to say, looking into, monitoring, in some cases investigating, or I suppose in many cases investigating these transnational financial secrecy networks, the regimes they are connected to, how that intersects with and interplays with the kind of lobbying networks that I'm now riding on, and then beyond that, how that ends up affecting policy in domestic constituencies, in this case, in the United States of America, but by no means limited to the United States of America. So again, it's I don't have a better answer than it's a position that allows me to continue doing what I am doing. I don't want to give away, I suppose, too much of some of the other things we have in the pipeline in terms of future reports and future investigations. I should say we just published our very first report. I've been here for about a year or so. We just had our first formal report come out about 2 months ago, looking specifically into what I have argued has been the most overlooked foreign influence and foreign interference network in the United States of America. And it's not out of Russia. It's not out of China. It's not out of places like Iran or Venezuela. It's out of a supposed American partner, the United Arab Emirates. And it is looking specifically at, and folks can go online. They can take a look at this report themselves. Maybe we can include it in the show notes here. Some of it is also in the book itself. But looking at how the United Arab Emirates has really pioneered the playbook in the 21st century as we get into the kind of middle section of the 21st century for how other regimes, other dictatorships can use lobbying, both illicit and licit, can use high-level, high-profile donations to American nonprofits, again, things like think tanks and universities, and especially most uniquely to the United Arab Emirates, what they've really pioneered is the hiring of scores of former American military officers and military officials to come aboard to, yes, of course, offer certain advice in the military space in terms of military and security reforms in the United Arab Emirates, but also to act as mouthpieces in Washington. This is a space that is ever evolving. It's really brand new. We have not seen a lot of other, if any other regimes do this. I think maybe the spoiler for the report, some of the book itself, is that the Emiratis were so successful that in the early 2010s, they brought aboard a gentleman named Jim Mattis, a retired general, to act as a so-called strategic advisor, military advisor. He did not have to publicly disclose any of that work, and he was, as folks may recall, appointed as the American Defense Secretary, the Secretary of Defense in the first Trump administration, so far the only Trump administration. Again, without disclosing that he had also worked hand in glove with the Emirati regime publicly. He had to disclose that privately to sitting members of the Senate and I suppose potentially members of the House of Representatives as well. But the American populace was completely in the dark that their brand new defense secretary had, up until right before his appointment, been working firmly within and firmly on behalf of the Emirati regime. And again, that is just one case study of many that we still do not know about, that folks can read about in our new report that we just published not long ago here at the Human Rights Foundation.
It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you to Casey for joining us. Foreign Agents is out next month, but is available to pre-order online now, which I recommend. If you're enjoying whale hunting, make sure to check out our website at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week for more. Thanks, Casey.
Thanks, Bradley.
That's it for this week, and thanks for listening. The best way to stay up to date with whale hunting is to hit follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also subscribe to the Whale Hunting newsletter for updates on the shadowy lives of the powerful and ultra-wealthy at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. That's whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean and Claire Urban. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.